Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar event, our formal launch of ClearSea's most recent research report on climate change vulnerability of the Canadian maritime environment. We're very excited to have you all join us here today. So my name is Jennifer Steele, and my role with ClearSeas is Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, where my home is located in Vancouver, BC, which is also home to ClearSea's headquarters. But our mandate serves all peoples in Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, from coast to coast to coast. So I'll start today by introducing the speakers that we have lined up. As you can see, ClearSeas is joined today by Dave Kreber and Rebecca Eldridge from Dillon Consulting, who are part of a larger consulting team that were contracted for this project and who are instrumental in carrying out the research that we'll be presenting today. Paul Blamaris, the Executive Director at ClearSeas, will join us for the Q&A session following the presentation. So after this welcome and over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll provide an overview on the project context and objectives for why we took on this work. From there, Dave and Becca will dig into the research on climate change vulnerability. This will include an overview of the research findings on different climate hazards, risks, and impacts, the strategies for managing them, and the best practices and strategies for climate change adaptation planning, all as they pertain to the different sectors of the Canadian maritime environment. We do have time for questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to enter your questions as they come up in the Q&A feature in Zoom, or ask them in the Q&A session when we get to it. Note that you can upvote other people's questions, so if someone else asks something that also piques your interest or curiosity, you can give it a thumbs up, and we'll try to address the most popular questions live in the Q&A. So before we get started, a few words about ClearSeas. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're an independent nonprofit research center focused on supporting safe and sustainable marine shipping. Our work involves better understanding and communicating on complex issues, which we do through a number of web-based and social media platforms, as well as at events, both online like this webinar and in person. We also run a number of programs that are geared towards expanding the reach of marine shipping research, knowledge, and skills, including 2 Indigenous programs which aim to provide skills and trainings for Indigenous peoples to help create employment opportunities in the marine industry across Canada. So we produce a range of research and communication products, some of which you see here, on topical marine shipping related issues that are aimed at the general public, policymakers, and industry. We very much believe that better information makes for better decisions, and a big part of our work involves building that base of information and resources for people to draw from, including our government departments and others that are responsible for delivering maritime services for Canadians in a way that is safe and sustainable. So that leads us to our topic of our particular research project that we're here to talk about today on climate change vulnerability of the Canadian maritime environment. So we know that climate change is an issue affecting all Canadians and that we're facing unprecedented challenges and the very real consequences of a changing climate. The Canadian maritime sector and the many different users of our marine environments aren't immune to these challenges. But there are things that we can do and that we should do now to plan and prepare and adapt so that we can manage for and mitigate the risks. So through this work with Dillon, our aim was really to provide for a resource that's designed to help characterize the threats posed by climate change and how these threats will impact Canadian waterways and their users, assess how these impacts may affect the delivery of maritime services, and discover potential strategies for how to manage the climate change adaptation process. So both by looking in Canada, but also looking outside for examples of best practices and strategies that are being taken by other jurisdictions. So a further note on context, funding for this work was provided by the Canadian Coast Guard, and the work was done in support of the Coast Guard's own climate change adaptation planning. However, we did design the research scope and do intend this as a resource for all people and organizations that rely on our oceans and waterways. So you'll see here a quote from the Canadian Coast Guard Commissioner in support of this work and the importance of understanding climate change threats and adaptation strategies as key to preparing for the future, and how research like this will help to inform the Coast Guard in transitioning to a low carbon, climate resilient, and green operations. So we couldn't agree more. We know how important these issues are and really hope that this research can be used and built upon by the Coast Guard and by others. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dillon to hear about the research findings. So Dave, over to you from here.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for attending today's presentation. I'm really pleased to be here. And prior to getting into talking about some of the climate hazards, risks, and impacts on the Canadian marine environment, first of all, we need to sort of define a few things so we're all operating in the same waters. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is when we talk about climate risk, what exactly are we talking about? And to understand climate change risk, it is important to recognize that it's determined based on the interactions of three key elements. The occurrence of a climate hazard, which are events or trends that could damage or cause losses to maritime assets. Examples of potential hazards include tropical cyclones, hurricanes, thunderstorms, tornadoes, sea level rise, or coastal erosion. The exposure of assets, maritime assets, operations, or services that could be adversely affected by said hazards. For instance, if we're looking at a potential, say, port, but if the port's not in the path of a hurricane, then there is no exposure of that port to that hazard. So in that case, there'd be no risk in that example. And the final sort of consideration is the vulnerability of those assets to be affected by the hazard as a function of their sensitivity and adaptive capability. This looks at the characteristics and the physical properties of each of the assets. Again, using the port as an example, what is the age of the infrastructure? How well is it maintained? Is it located in a sheltered area, or is the area that it's located more exposed to potential climate hazards? Impacts, when we talk about impacts there, they represent the consequences of realized climate risks on assets and systems. Impacts for the hurricane and port example could include storm surge that destroys port infrastructure due to a hurricane. Adaptation collectively represents actions which seek to manage the impacts of climate change and may include efforts to mitigate the impacts or enhance the resiliency of assets, operations, and systems. Next, I'm going to define two key terms that we talk a lot about when we're talking about climate change hazards. And I want to make sure that we clearly define them, because sometimes they're used interchangeably and they shouldn't be. So the first one I want to talk about is mitigation. And mitigation are actions that try to reduce the drivers of climate change. This includes reducing emissions or enhancing greenhouse gas sinks or captures in order to reduce the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. A good example of a mitigation action would be switching from, say, fueling vessels with bunker C to another lower emission fuel source like ultra low sulfur diesel. Adaptation is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate change and its effects. For example, the Port of Rotterdam is considering raising flood barriers and shoreline protection measures to deal with potential flood risks. The focus of our report in this presentation is on the adaptation measures to help manage and respond to climate change risks and impacts. You may be wondering, why should I be interested in adaptation strategies? Well, it's really a matter of money. It's cheaper to plan and implement climate change adaptation measures than is to rebuild and to respond after climate change risks impact your maritime assets. So when I talk about climate change hazards, there are four main climate change hazards that impact the Canadian maritime environment. And I'm just going to talk here briefly about these four. And then the first one I want to talk about is ocean chemistry. And it has four main points that I want to sort of discuss. Ocean chemistry can include changes in temperature. And changes in ocean temperature can lead to changes in species composition and abundance, as well as it could lead to changes in shifting ecosystem dynamics. Changes in salinity may result in increases in more saline areas and decreases in fresher areas. And this could lead to, significant more damage to coastal infrastructure. Acidification of the ocean has potential to cause dissolution of carbonate exoskeletons, like in diatoms and shellfish. And it could be detrimental to protective shoreline vegetation. And finally, oxygen depletion can lead to hypoxic areas or dead zones and physiological impairments in fish kills. Changes in ocean chemistry can impact marine fishing, infrastructure, as well as marine tourism. Sea level rise can lead to flooding and overtopping of coastal infrastructure. It can lead to coastal erosion, flooding of protective barriers like dikes and breakwaters, as well as it can lead to landward migration of the shoreline. And again, it can impact marine fishing, shipping, infrastructure, and transportation. Extreme weather. Extreme weather can lead to more frequent and intense storms, drought, or rainfall, which can result in damages to ports and vessels. As well, there can be significant indirect impacts to other industries. For example, droughts could affect agricultural production, which could lead to a decrease in the requirements for maritime transportation at certain ports. Changes in the cryosphere, right? So changes in the sort of Arctic and ice environment. Permafrost areas have a greater risk of coastal erosion with the melting of the permafrost. The permafrost can sometimes act as a kind of adhesive to keep that soil in that. And with the melting of the permafrost, that soil can erode. Spatial and temporal extent of sea ice is rapidly decreasing. And potential increase in Arctic shipping capacity, but it could also but the increase in the opening up the Arctic can be both beneficial and negative. And I'll talk a bit about that in the next couple slides. And what I want to make clear is these four hazards are interconnected. They're not mutually exclusive. And that can be illustrated by a couple of examples shown here on the slide. For example, sea level rise plus extreme weather can lead to an increased risk of flooding. The permafrost melt and sea level rise can lead to accelerated coastal erosion. So next, I want to talk about the impacts on the Canadian maritime environment. And based on our review and the interviews we conducted as part of this research, we've identified 7 main impacts climate change can have on the Canadian maritime environment in these sort of sectors. The first one I want to talk about is port and coastal infrastructure. And I will say, in this presentation, I can only touch on these briefly, but they're described in detail in our report. Ports serve as a critical function in global commerce as important nodes in the supply chain and are relied upon for most economic activity. Therefore, any significant impacts to port infrastructure can have large impacts to the local, national, and global economy. And we saw that during the COVID-19. Commercial maritime shipping. Climate change is likely to impact maritime trade routes as storms will become more intense and frequent. Marine transportation plays a critical role in the movement of goods to communities across the Canadian Arctic. Impacts to ports and coastal infrastructure will also lead to impacts to commercial marine shipping, potentially delaying vessels from entering or exiting ports and offloading or loading their cargo. Marine fishing. Climate change will affect commercial fish species, habitat, abundance, and location, meaning potential changes to fishing seasons and species caught. As well, climate change could lead to more hazardous working conditions for our fishers, with an increase in the severity and frequency of extreme weather events. Marine tourism. Climate change could impact tourism by creating opportunities in some areas, like the opening up of the Arctic with reduced sea ice, making the Arctic more open for tourism, but it can be both a positive and a negative, as it means there's potential for more revenue in the Arctic as a part of tourism, but the infrastructure doesn't exist in the Arctic to support that increase in shipping. Inland waterway transportation. Changes in climate patterns could lead to periods of drought or heavy precipitation in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway that could lead to variability in water levels that will challenge the infrastructure. The infrastructure is not necessarily designed to support the extreme weather and drought and could limit the ability of goods to flow within the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway. Indigenous perspectives. Climate change has the potential to impact traditional harvesting for Indigenous communities, as well as increased safety risks for traveling in northern waters. And finally, Arctic sovereignty and security. 8 countries claim the Arctic, and increased access due to climate change could lead to an increase in international tensions, as well as additional pollution and security risks. Now I'm going to talk about the two primary impacts, or the two types of impacts that I want to discuss. There's primary and secondary impacts. And so primary impacts are impacts resulting directly from a climate change hazard. And there's some examples here that I want to discuss. There could be direct damages to wharves, vessels, port infrastructure from storms or coastal erosion. There could be population changes from in shifting ecosystem dynamics. Fish kills, increased competition, invasive species migration, and traveling. There could be increased navigation hazards and safety risks due to more frequent and severe storms, changes in the climate and fog patterns, changing in sea ice, potential increase in calving and icebergs in northern areas, which could lead to an increase in spills and pollution risks. As well, with the opening of the Arctic, there could be increase in illegal entry and poaching. So those are just some examples of primary impacts. Next, I want to talk about some secondary impacts. And these secondary impacts are impacts that are resulting from the primary impacts. So an example would be, say a storm, like a hurricane, damages port infrastructure. Well, that will result in the inability of vessels to enter that port and load and offload their goods. So that's an example of secondary impacts. Other ones could be, safety risks. The opening of the Arctic can mean more people traveling in the Arctic, and they may not be experienced and have the necessary experience to be successful in transiting the Northwest Passage in Arctic water. There could be loss of critical services and infrastructure. Storm damage could result in loss of power or communications. So those are some examples of secondary impacts. Next, we're going to talk about some adaptation strategies for managing climate hazards and the risks in the Canadian maritime sector. So when we talk about climate adaptation, we're really discussing five general themes that we've sort of discovered during our research. I'm going to talk about each of these here right now. And what I want to stress, though, is these five categories are not mutually exclusive. When you're looking at how to adapt to climate change, you can use a variety of these categories. So the first one I want to talk about is procedural. These are techniques that support or inform the planning of adaptation measures. And they can include data collection, coastal zoning to limit development in vulnerable areas, and regulatory procedures that require the incorporation of climate change considerations in the design of coastal infrastructure. Avoidance. Avoid developing in areas and placing infrastructure in vulnerable areas. This could include, mapping of low-lying areas and avoiding development in areas that are susceptible to storm surge, coastal erosion, or sea level rise. Accommodation involves the attempt to reduce or minimize the impacts of climate change on assets using engineering designs or nature-based measures. And they can include, raising breakwaters, planting protective landscaping or erosion-prone areas. Or an example from some of the Caribbean work we did was replanting mangrove areas where they're previously removed. Protection reduces the impacts on infrastructure and the environment by protecting them through barriers. This can include, riprap armoring around critical infrastructure or using a combination of riprap and plants to protect infrastructure. And the final one is retreat, where you relocate vulnerable assets to prevent an impact. A good example of this comes from the United States Coast Guard, where they have relocated their emergency radio towers from beside their emergency response bases on the water to more protected areas to prevent them from getting damaged during extreme weather. So as I said, these five categories are not mutually exclusive. You should be looking at a mix and match of these when you're adapting to climate change risks. Now I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Rebecca, who will provide some additional examples on how these strategies can be used to help manage the risk in the 7 sectors of the Canadian maritime environment we previously discussed.
Great, thank you so much, Dave. So to demonstrate what some of these adaptation strategies may look like in practice, we've selected just a few examples here that are relevant to each of the sectors that we've previously identified, but of course more details can be found in our report. So first, looking at port and coastal infrastructure, this is the primary sector where retreat would be employed. So retreating is typically used when other adaptation strategies are no longer applicable. So this would involve relocating vulnerable infrastructure, especially in coastal areas, to prevent damage or any further damage if some has already occurred. Accommodation strategies for this sector may include the replenishment of sand on coastal shorelines to help manage erosion. So this was actually an example from the Netherlands called the sand engine, where eroded sand was continually placed back to its original location to help prevent some of that landward migration of the shoreline that Dave spoke about earlier, which in turn protects the infrastructure that's located there. Elevating coastal buildings to protect against sea level rise is another accommodation strategy that can be effective in some regions. And some protective measures may include installing nearshore breakwaters or artificial reefs to help manage the impacts resulting from sea level rise and storm surge. Looking at the marine shipping sector, accommodating potential delays or closures of marine transportation services may involve ensuring that alternative transportation links are available for essential services in the event of these more intense and frequent storms that we're speaking about. In cases where vulnerable or at-risk populations have shifted their migratory or feeding patterns due to changes in ocean chemistry, such as warming waters, or if there's any dead zones, shifting locations of these shipping lanes may be required to avoid interacting with these species. Protective measures may include improvements to vessel design to ensure that assets are being protected from storm damage or from run-ins with ice from ice calving in the Arctic. For marine fishing, incorporating climate change data into fisheries models will be helpful in predicting and planning for the future. More intense and frequent storms may require modifications to vessels and fleets, similar to in the marine shipping industry, to accommodate larger surf and rougher seas. And finally, for marine fishing, it may be necessary to eventually adapt fishing seasons and locations to avoid vulnerable populations and areas, and also to chase down those commercially harvested species that may or may not be kind of shifting where they are in the ocean, depending on changes in ocean chemistry. For the marine and coastal tourism sector, accommodation strategies may include the management of erosion in coastal areas that are important for tourism, so similar to a lot of the strategies we may see in the port and coastal infrastructure sector. An avoidance strategy that is actually also procedural in nature for this sector could include further regulation of development for new tourism activities to avoid vulnerable areas or populations, especially in some of these regions that my colleague Dave spoke about earlier, where permafrost melting may put these coastal areas at even greater risk. Increasing the forecasting, planning, and permitting for tourism-based vessel activities in the Arctic is also a procedural strategy that may be useful in managing the expected increase in activity in the north. So as Dave spoke about, there's a lack of supporting infrastructure for a lot of this increased activity that we expect to see. Inland waterway transport. So this sector may be impacted by more intense and frequent rainfall. So an accommodation strategy for this sector may be the restoration or the construction of floodplains and flood bypass zones. A knowledge gap identified for this sector that actually came out of our interviews were the specific sources of erosion to help inform management. So this would be a procedural strategy that would also be beneficial to employ here, really digging into that data and collecting data to determine where the erosion is exactly coming from. Protective measures for this sector may include hard armoring. So this would include things like the construction of bulkheads or seawalls, or soft armoring, which involves creating or restoring a natural shoreline system like wetlands and riparian buffers or the mangrove forests that Dave was speaking about. And these soft armoring measures are great because they also provide additional benefits like improving water quality and enhancing habitat for aquatic and terrestrial organisms. So Indigenous governments in the North are currently implementing procedural adaptation strategies, including research and monitoring to help inform policy development. And also they're conducting vulnerability assessments, which are a key component of identifying priorities for adaptation. Nature-based strategies have been identified as priority measures for accommodating sea level rise and weather events in traditional harvesting areas in the north. So as Dave mentioned earlier, changes in the cryosphere, so sea ice melting and things kind of opening up, this will likely lead to the opening of shipping lanes through the Arctic, and specifically in the Northwest Passage. So this came up a lot in our research. We're expecting to see an increase in instances of illegal entry and poaching and trafficking by small vessels in these regions with increased access. So an increase in regulatory and monitoring practices has been identified by multiple participants that we interviewed and in the literature as a strategy to help manage these issues, and as well to implement some strategic planning in the event that the sovereignty of the Northwest Passage specifically is called into question. So adaptation planning and implementing these practices can look very different depending on the region, the context, and the sector. But there are some best practices that we've identified through this work that really best inform strategic planning. So the overall strategy should be system, asset, operation, or facility specific, and should be based on risk and vulnerability assessment frameworks. So within a particular climate change adaptation strategy, it's important to consider utilizing climate data and scenarios that are reflective of future climates, keeping in mind that adaptation strategies should have a planning horizon beyond 30 years, which is a bit farther into the future than many people expect to be planning toward. So collaborating with research, government, industry, and others is a really important aspect of gathering this climate data and using it effectively. It's also really important to develop an inventory of infrastructure assets and an inventory of operations and systems so that these data can be integrated into vulnerability assessments. And there's some really good examples of this in Norway and in the Netherlands, where a lot of these different sectors, industry, government, NGOs have come together to form this climate database that everybody can use. It's also important to conduct risk and vulnerability assessments in collaboration with subject matter experts, staff, and local stakeholders to ensure the picture is being considered. If you take a look at our report, you'll read a little bit about maladaptation. And so this is something that we really want to avoid when an adaptation strategy, maybe isn't tailored exactly to the perfect situation at hand, and is maybe set for a bigger picture. And so a lot of those little details are missed. When considering adaptation options, including operation and institutional measures alongside the structural and physical measures is key. So looking back at the procedural strategies that we talked about and back to Dave's comment about incorporating those into the strategy along with physical measures if they're also applicable. So you want to use a mix and match of a lot of different strategies that we've covered. It's important to consider that different regions have different needs when it comes to adaptation. So something that may work to adapt infrastructure in New Brunswick may not be applicable in Vancouver or in the Arctic. So it's important to not use a one-size-fits-all approach, but to consider the regional and sectoral differences as well. When making climate-related decisions, it's also best practice to account for the entire lifespan of the physical infrastructure. So this was raised by a couple of folks that we interviewed, and not just the operation phase, but taking into account right from the very, very start to the very end of the new infrastructure that's going in, or any infrastructure that's being updated or renovated. Using economic analysis methods and tools that can accommodate uncertainty in climate projections will also be useful. Monitoring and evaluating adaptation strategies is also just as important as implementing them in the first place. So adaptation strategies should be consistently reviewed and updated frequently to incorporate the most recent and the most accurate available data. And lastly, this applies to every phase of the adaptation planning. It's really critical to communicate research and strategies appropriately. So climate data, risk assessments, adaptation options, and reports, all of these different factors, all of these things should be considered, and they should be made easily understood by decision makers and by civil society. All of this information needs to be available and accessible to all levels of government, non-governmental organizations, and industry to encourage collaboration and communication through all stages of planning. So with that, just a couple of key takeaways from our talk today. And of course, as we mentioned, please take a look at our full report for further details and examples. But climate change is a reality, and the marine environment does need to adapt. It can affect various subsectors of the Canadian marine environment with both primary impacts and secondary impacts that are cascading that we may not even really be able to see until they start happening. Vulnerability decision-making is not a one-size-fits-all process. These strategies should be system-specific or asset or operation or facility-specific. And most importantly, they should account for both short and long-term planning. So thinking back to that 30-year planning horizon that we talked about. Lastly, climate change adaptation and implementation is generally less expensive than responding to climate-related crises down the road. So with a little bit of planning, it can really go a long way to help adapt to some of these realities. Perfect. With that, I'll hand it back over to Clear Seas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave and Becca. So we're going to turn it over here to questions, and I'll ask that all of our speakers join us back on camera here. So I know there's a couple things coming through on the chat, but I'll remind people there's a Q&A panel in Zoom that we're going to use to curate the questions that are coming through from the group. So please put them in that Q&A panel. If there's any questions in the chat, we'll have a look at those as we get started as well, but over to the Q&A panel. So I think, Paul, I think I will stop sharing so that you can see us all. And hopefully we're all up back on screen.
Well, maybe I could start by thanking the team from Dillon for the presentation, but also for the work on putting together the report. It's certainly comprehensive and a fantastic resource to those that are engaged in this process. I think it's very timely too. I know that Canada, well, the federal government is working on producing a national adaptation strategy that is due to be finished later this year. And so I hope you'd agree this will be a good resource for those engaged in that, certainly thinking about the maritime environment. So I guess we can look at some of the questions, should we? I'm just looking at, I think from Stafford raised, I think a question about the oil spill response. So undertaking gap analysis of when oil spill equipment is effective. And I think, well, perhaps it's worth raising this is exactly the kind of use case that could be undertaken with this one kind of a tool. I guess I don't know whether Becca, you wanted to respond about how somebody might be able to do that with the tools that are available.
Perfect. Yeah, so definitely just reading your question there, Amy. This is Amy Renaud. So for industries that have no infrastructure-based project, it's tough because a lot of the adaptation strategies that we talked about are focused on infrastructure. And a lot of the difference between, going back to the difference between adaptation and mitigation, there's a lot of things that we can do that aren't infrastructure based, that are based in mitigation. So down our emissions.
Oh, looks like we have a freeze there.
Maybe just to build on what Rebecca was saying.
So yeah, that's a tough one. It's Dave, I'm not sure if you have anything that you'd like to add, but I'll maybe let you step in.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, like a lot of what we talk about is infrastructure, but it can be equally applied to operations, assets, or procedures. So, even if it's not infrastructure related, there's certain policies and procedures that could be reviewed and revised with a climate change risk lens. And so, you might not have a physical infrastructure, but maybe some of the policies, procedures that you do thinking like, potential changes in when the vessel goes out, limitations due to changes in the frequency and severity of storms may be a consideration, or certain, certain physical assets that are used on vessels, like anchors may need to be adjusted due to potential increases in the hazards from climate change. So there's just a couple of examples I could think of, but certainly it's not limited to that.
Yeah, and that's certainly relevant to the comment from Stafford on oil spill response that says those are procedural responses. So, and I think that's something that, we know that Canadian Coast Guard and some of the response organizations are looking at precisely that question that said, taking into account these weather conditions and ocean conditions, when would the oil spill response equipment that they have available be usable, and what changes do they need to make both to the procedures but potentially to additional acquisitions that they need to make to be ready.
I think a lot of our strategies are based that we came across are based on procedural as well, so just to kind of wrap up that point, an increase in the planning and the permitting and the forecasting, all of that's going to be really helpful in those situations as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the responses there, and thanks Stafford for the comments that you provided in the chat. I'd encourage everyone to go and take a look there at greater detail. Stafford's clarified that they're more just observations on a question per se for the panelists, but if there is a follow-on question to that, we're open to hearing them in the chat. So we do have another question came in from Marianne Cassidy. So Marianne asks, as sea ice continues to melt in the Arctic environment, large quantities of microplastics will be released into the marine environment from melting sea ice. What sort of mitigation strategies could be employed to protect marine fauna? Is this something that Dillon has considered?
Yeah, so I can start with that one. Yeah, that's we came across that a lot in our research as well. There's a lot of microplastics trapped in not only the sea ice, but in the snow in northern environments as well. And so just going back to the mitigation versus adaptation, mitigating this would kind of be considered a secondary impact. The sea ice is melting, and that's the primary impact. The release of the microplastics is a secondary impact. So I know there's a lot of research going on right now with microplastics in the Canadian marine environment. And so as far as mitigating this issue, it's really getting a handle on microplastics and their release into the environment in the first place. But as far as adapting to this issue, continuing to research, I think is a primary area of focus, because there's not a lot that we know about microplastics yet. It's still a pretty novel, pretty emerging contaminant in the grand scheme of things. So continuing to research and take on some of these procedural strategies for planning and looking ahead may be a good approach there.
Thanks, Becca. Any other questions for our speakers and panels today?
Maybe I have a question for Dave and for Rebecca on the, as you were conducting those interviews with the experts, perhaps you can reflect a bit on what was the most surprising conclusion or insight you gained as part of the interview process.
I can start, and then I'll turn it over to Rebecca. One of the most surprising things, I guess, I thought, and is that it shouldn't be a surprise, but it was kind of how much they're talking about. Like it's not one size fits all. Like when we talk, like a lot of the talk I used to hear is, there's a national strategy for climate change adaptation, and that's great on a holistic scale, but a lot of the times details matter and it varies by region, right? As Becca said, what works in New Brunswick won't work in Vancouver, won't work up north. And it was really sort of surprising to me to see that, even though there's national strategies, it is being tailored to individual sort of coastal community infrastructure asset operationals across coast to coast to coast. So to me, that was, I guess, a surprising finding.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Dave. Just to kind of add to that comment, I think there's a lot of as we were doing this research, there's so much research out there about climate data and climate science. And I guess kind of the biggest thing for me was realizing, a lot of the risk and vulnerability assessments that are being undertaken. We have a lot of really good examples in the US, even within Canada, that different municipalities are working on. But the focus, I guess, on conducting these vulnerability assessments and risk assessments for specific systems or assets or operations within specific regions and within specific sectors, that was really a huge focus of a lot of the work that we came across. I found that there were less data pertaining to actual concrete, effects on impacts on different sectors and different regions than there is on how to do this risk assessment and this vulnerability assessment planning, the best. So I think that there's a lot of focus right now on developing these best practices and, frameworks for how to strategize appropriately and make sure everything's captured appropriately in adaptation strategies, which is great. But it definitely was surprising to me that, there's more focus on that area than there is on the actual impact. So we need to get moving quickly, I guess, is kind of where I'm going with that. It's there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of great work that's been done, but I think we need to start taking these adaptation strategies and the best practices that we're learning about and really start seeing them come to fruition.
Thanks, Becca. So we've had a couple more questions come in on the chat. So from Amy Renaud, I'm not sure if the panel can help with this one, but for vessels looking for alternatives for their plastic-based mooring lines, example, polysteel, has anyone on this panel found any green alternatives to help reduce the amount of plastic?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a good example of a potential accommodation, switching from polysteel into, less plastic based, but that wasn't really a specific focus of our research. Our research really focused on looking at adaptation from a sort of broader perspective, but it's certainly that is a potential good adaptation strategy that could be looked at.
Thanks, Dave. And Amy had a follow-on from that as a note for future research projects with a huge gap in information for crew who are looking for information on green alternatives for their single-use products that they use on a daily basis and can be really helpful for us going forward. So thank you very much for that note. That's definitely something that we'll add to our considerations for adaptation strategies. And I'm losing my headphone from my ear, sorry. We'll keep it in the pipeline for ClearSea's future projects. So. And we had another question from Stadford Reed come in. Have you interviewed major international shipping companies on what they're considering regarding adaptation and mitigation?
We did not. Oh, sorry, you can go ahead, Dave.
I'll let you answer it, Rebecca, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say they were not part of our interviews, but that would be a really good step moving forward. As we kind of talked about in the presentation and definitely in detail in the report is the importance of collaboration and communication. It just goes back to the many brains are better than one. So seeing what large international shipping companies are doing, I'm sure could be really beneficial for informing adaptation strategies in, on a more local scale and on a national scale here in Canada. So that would definitely be something to look into in the future that we'll consider for sure.
Yeah, and it's a good example of the interconnectedness, right? So changing traffic patterns or changing vessel sizes of international shipping lines may have knock-on consequences that need to be considered in local planning. So I think, as the report recommends, keeping an eye on all of the potential impacts from things that you might not initially consider to be a consequence of climate change. This is a good example.
We just had another question come in from Sagnik Sarkar. So considering the impacts of climate change impacts are going to increase with the rise of global temperature and the adaptation strategies are offering shorter term protection compared to mitigation measures, what is the suggested budget resource allocation ratio among these strategies from government as well as commercial shipping companies' perspective? I'm not sure if we have that level of insight, but I think that's
that's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and really, I think the answer would come out of sort of your strategy development, right? Like it'd come out of your risk assessment. So you look at your assets, you look at your climate data, and then do your vulnerability risk assessment, and that could help inform you. What is the cost, and then that could be a sort of joint conversation between you and various levels of government on how to address that. But we certainly didn't dive into that question as part of our research.
I'll add one quick note to that. I think a big point to consider is mitigation is great, and I think that through a lot of the research that we've come across, that should definitely be a focus. But in a lot of situations, mitigation is no longer an option. There's already areas where sea level has risen to the point where infrastructure needs to be relocated or accommodation strategies are necessary. So, the focus of this project was on adaptation, kind of, which is a little more short term than planning for mitigation. But yeah, always against the backdrop of mitigating as much as possible, obviously, makes adaptation not as necessary in some cases. So.
Great, thank you. So we don't have any more open questions. I think there's a comment that just came in the chat, but I think it's more for the folks to encouraging to look at. Anyone concerned with the marine environment can read The Outlaw Ocean by Ian Urbina about where pollution goes into the deep seas. So that's just a note for people in the chat. We do have a couple more minutes for questions. So if anybody has anything, now's sort of your chance, but if not, we'll give it another couple seconds and then we'll close from there. Oh, we got another one in from Mark Rodonnet. So do we have any data on how the Earth, I don't think that's actually relevant to what we're talking about here. So we'll skip that one, but thank you for the interest. And thanks for the note from Amy in the chat about thanking us for the great presentation. So Deborah Wren came in. So what developing strategies, how far into the future should we be planning for? How reliable is the data to support long-term planning?
Yeah, I can tackle this one. So a lot of the information that we came across when we were looking for best practices, really the smallest timeline was 30 years into the future. So it is quite a ways out. Climate change is not it's not the sea level's not rising a meter every day, but that 30-year horizon was something that came up more and more often, but kind of as far out as possible, keeping in mind that there is a level of uncertainty there. So the IPCC puts out climate projections. They have different scenarios, worst case scenarios, not as bad scenarios, and so another thing that you'll see in our report as well is another best practice was to always plan for the worst case scenario. So 30 years out, worst case is kind of the framework that we came across the most.
Thanks, Becca. Okay, I don't have any other live questions there, so I think we're getting close on the end of our time. So I think we'll call it there. I just wanted to thank everyone again for our speakers for joining us today. Dave and Becca, it's great to have you, and Paul, thanks for joining us. So, and with that, I'm just gonna share my screen again for a short wrap up. So. Yeah, so again, just thanks everyone for your time. We just wanted to say on behalf of Clear Seas and our speakers, a big thank you to everyone for joining us. It's great to see the level of interest for that this work is generating, and to have an engaged audience and the questions that are coming through for our panelists. So, and as said again, I'll just say it one more time. Thank you again to Dave and Becca for joining us, and as well to the rest of the Dillon team who worked on this project. So to wrap up, if you're interested in learning more about the project and the results, more information can be found in the full report. It's available on our website at clearseas.org. I've shared a link in the chat already, but I'll post it up there again before we close out today. And also just wanted to say that we have done a recording of today's webinar. We'll put that on the project page website, so you can come back and have a listen again, as well as it'll include the full Q&A session as well. So if you want to stay in touch with Clear Seas, please do so by signing up for our quarterly newsletter or by checking us out and following us on the social media platforms. So we have platforms on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and you can get your different hits that way. You can also watch out for new blogs, research projects, and events through these different channels and find out more by visiting our webpage. So with that, I will thank everyone again. It's been great to have you here. I'm just going to drop the chat to the link to the research report in the chat again. So if you want to grab that, it'll be there, but you can find it at clearseas.org. So with that, thanks everyone and have a great day.